Hello, Julie Morgan.
Hello.
Hello, everyone watching. Welcome to another episode of Uncomplicating HR. Again, I am joined today by the beautiful Julie Morgan, who, yes, I just said hello to because she really warms my heart today. Today is her 10-year Inspiring HR anniversary. And beyond that, Julie and I go all the way back to 1998, and we just giggled about the fact that we actually still like each other, which is fascinating. Julie, we'll jump right in right there. Why don't you tell everybody a little bit about your story of how we met?
So, I was a recent college grad and I landed my first job, my first big girl job out of college, and we were working for the same company. And it just so happened you were overseeing the department that I was hired into. And although I didn't report directly to you, I reported indirectly to you. So we had a lot of interactions, and I was involved in a lot of projects and things going on within the department. We just made a connection immediately. We just really hit it off. We have very similar personalities and same perspectives as it relates to work and life and everything combined with that. So we just, we had a really strong, respectful, professional relationship, and that grew into a strong connection outside of work at a personal level and became really good friends. And we've stayed connected ever since, which is wonderful.
I know.
And here we are
Nice?
today.
And the man you married was directly across the parking lot from me in the apartment complex where a lot of us lived, which
Yes.
is so funny.
Yes. And we'll be
so funny.
celebrating 25 years of
Congratulations.
marriage next year. So
I was at that wedding, everyone. I was at that wedding.
And you were,
But I had already left Florida. I went to D.C., flew back to Florida for Julie and Jason's wedding.
yeah,
So,
and you were the
yes.
driver behind that. You're the one that introduced us. So thank you.
Yeah, I will take that credit happily because you two are still to this day an adorable couple. So I will happily take that credit. All right. So on today's episode of Uncomplicating HR, we're talking about dreaded compliance things. I don't like to sell people and telling them they need compliance, but risk mitigation and following labor laws, even understanding labor laws, are a part of risk mitigation for any growing, primarily small business. And you have become a bit of an expert, particularly with remote teams and multi-state labor law compliance. So I thought, who better to talk to about this complicated stuff in Uncomplicating HR than Julie? And I want to note that we did not simplify as one of our core values, but we didn't want to replicate that into the YouTube series that we're working on, so we went with Uncomplicated. One of the things we often chat about before we just dive into that is simplified possible with wage and hour? What's your take on this? I'm going to ask you about your grasp of wage and hour in remote and distributed teams, and probably the first thing we're going to touch on is the Fair Labor Standards Act, but is simplified possible with labor law compliance in your mind?
Absolutely. I mean, as long as you have a good understanding of what the law is, in a lot of instances, it is black and white. Now, you do have some labor law that has gray area to it, but you can still simplify that process and, really understand what the law is, how it impacts your business, how to implement it, how to enforce it, is a driver behind the success of that particular law. So, it takes a good understanding of how to implement it into the business to really simplify the process.
And I will give a plug to everyone on our staff who are exceptional at simplified communications. And what I often think about is what policies in your handbook or the addendums, if you're multi-state, demonstrate that you understand what is required of you on a federal and state level. And there's no clearer sign than a simplified, compliant policy in your handbook that demonstrates we know what we're doing around here. It also sends a very credible message to your team, particularly new hires. I mean, you get a new hire that comes on board, they might know more than you in this day and age when it comes to labor laws, and they may be questioning whether or not they made the right choice in that work environment if your employee handbook is really inaccurate or you don't have one at all. And again, I don't want to harp on labor laws just being a part of your HR infrastructure. There's lots that goes into your people management infrastructure, but I do think we are particularly skilled on this team in terms of turning a labor law compliance obligation that is full of legalese into a very simple policy that can be understood in an employee handbook.
Absolutely.
So let's take a crack at the federal labor law that it has been confusing people since 1938. Yes, 1938. Now, I don't really know what form of exempt versus non-exempt existed in 1938, but I do know the Fair Labor Standards Act, the FLSA, passed in 1938. Julie, still, no one gets this. Probably half of our week still is occupied with explaining exempt versus non. Tell me why you think this is still misunderstood and where this shows up in your work day to day.
So it's really trying to communicate and understand the difference between exempt and non-exempt. I would say it's pretty common for me to get a question from a client, or they make a comment about an employee and their compensation, and they'll say something on the lines of, well, I pay this employee a salary. Well, how do you have this employee classified? Well, what does that mean? Are they classified as exempt or are they classified as non-exempt? So sometimes there's confusion about how you pay someone and how they earn that pay. Do they earn it because they are being paid for every hour that they work, which is a non-exempt employee, and they're getting paid an hourly rate of pay? Or are they being paid a fixed salary to perform a job function within the organization? And that's typically an exempt employee. So really trying to teach and coach clients about what those differences are and making them understand that just because you say that you're paying someone a salary doesn't mean that they're exempt. It's the job responsibilities that determine whether or not that position meets an exemption under FLSA standards. And that is very complex at times, but we simplify that by basically giving them the facts and saying, this is an administrative classification, and these are the points that this position has to meet in order for you to say this is an exempt position. An exempt meaning you're exempt from overtime wages, minimum wage standards, and so on. So getting them to understand that's what exempt is and this is what non-exempt is can be challenging. But once we go through the process and kind of talk it through and we give them the tools and the skill set to make that determination, it becomes simpler. So we're there to help with that process.
Well, what's so interesting to me as you're talking through this, and I know we often chat about all these missteps with FLSA compliance. What do you say to the client that says, because you already mentioned this, just because their salary doesn't make them exempt from overtime? And by the way I explain it is salary, you're paid to get a job done regardless of hours worked. And yes, you don't have to pay overtime, but the door doesn't swing both ways. Put a pin in that for a moment.
Okay.
What do you say to the client or someone inquiring about, what if, okay, I concede they're non-exempt, but I want to continue to pay them a salary anyway? What's some guidance you would give them in that regard?
Well, I first start asking questions. What is this role? What are the job responsibilities? Do we have a job description that clearly defines the essential functions of this job? Because that will help determine whether or not it should be classified as non-exempt. At the end of the day, our employers do have the capability, if it truly is an exempt position, you can actually classify it as non-exempt if you choose to do so, but the same doesn't happen in reverse. So, we talk through the job responsibilities, how they're being compensated, what are their weekly hours worked, to get a better understanding of big picture, because then that will help me guide them as to what path we go down to. So, if this employee is working 40 hours or less each week, then we say, okay, if they're non-exempt and you want to pay them a fixed salary, that shouldn't be an issue. However, you do have to track the hours that they work, because as a non-exempt
That's the key point. They think salary equals I don't have to have them track their time, which is false.
Absolutely, yes. And that is a big misconception. So, then we talk about, well, you have to track hours worked. Even though you're paying a salary, if they work more than 40 hours, now we have to determine what their overtime rate of pay is, and we need to pay them accordingly. So again, just like you said, just because you're getting a salary doesn't necessarily mean that you are classified as exempt.
Yeah.
We just have to walk through each step of the process and make the best determination based on what the job responsibilities are.
Right. The other thing I put a pin in is I find it fascinating, and again, trying to have it both ways. And for anyone listening, I get it. I get being a small business owner. I get being tight on budgets. I get on maximizing capital and keeping labor costs low. I get all of that. But there's also an element of fairness and what labor laws expect of you. And your largest looming risk, by the way, is not a Department of Labor, IRS, or poster compliance person boogeyman standing outside your office. Your lingering risk, really, unless you're in key industries, is a retaliatory ex-employee. And this is why we often encourage you to mitigate risk by understanding this so you can make informed decisions. So to that end, what do we tell clients who they say, I've paid a salary, we go through the questions and the answers, it seems to be an exempt position, probably because we erred in that gray area under the administrative exemption of, okay, your call. I'm not so sure I agree, but it's your call on whether or not this is an exempt position. Fast forward 6 months later, the employee is out of paid time off, and they don't feel well, and they need to leave at 2 o'clock on Friday. And now that company wants to dock their pay by 3 hours' time. Our answer to that would be?
Absolutely not.
Right. Because
as an exempt classified position, you are being paid a fixed salary to perform the job itself, regardless of however many hours you work in that work week. So if you work 10 hours, your salary is the same versus working 80 hours in that work week.
That's right.
So
That's right.
there's certain,
My point on not being able to have it both ways.
Yeah. And with that, there's situations where you are permitted to reduce wages of an exempt employee, but we're very restricted and limited, and it's certain circumstances. And so,
Give everybody an example of one, an easy example of when you can prorate salary on a daily basis.
So if someone is hired and their start date starts on Wednesday and your traditional 7-day work week is Monday to Sunday. So they're starting in the middle of a work week, you can prorate their salary for that start week. Same thing for a termination. If a termination ends in the middle of the week, then you can reduce wages there. So that would be one example.
Yep. Yeah. And also FMLA for those companies that are more than 50 employees and have to comply with FMLA. Let's talk a little bit about that administrative exemption. There's that gray area. There's that gray area duty in administrative exemption. By the way, I don't know about you, but when they insist it's a salary exempt position, I usually start in the order of the Fair Labor Standards Act fact sheet. Thrilling read, everybody. It's fact sheet 17A, but it starts with executive, and I often go, okay, if they don't have 2 or more full-time direct reports or the equivalent, let's move on. So then the next exemption I go to is either administrative or professional, and administrative more often than professional. So tell me how this gray area of, okay, it's administrative, and part of that is they have to be in a role that doesn't necessarily have direct reports, but they're high level enough to be involved in decision making of, I think it's matters of significance, which is very subjective for people. How do you navigate that conversation, that annoying gray area? Because I think this is where we help clients make judgment calls the most, is this.
So thankfully, the fact sheet gives you a little guidance when it comes to that gray area. So that's part of our talking point in that conversation, is really looking to what the fact sheet definition is describing to us. And, I always ask the question again, do you have a job description? Because maybe that job description is going to give us the answer.
That's true.
As to
Very
where
good point.
we fall within that gray area. And if they don't have a job description, then we start, going through I say like the top 10 to 12 essential duties of that job. And is there anything within those top 10 or 12 that would fall within that gray area category that would give us the indication that, yes, this would meet an administrative exemption under FLSA law? So that's usually the path that we take in making that determination. And if at the end we still are undecided as to where we land, then I say let's err on caution and classify it as non-exempt.
Non-exempt.
It's the safer way to go. Or
It is.
Talk to an attorney who's going to give you a little bit more direction there. But I would say let's just be conservative.
I would bet the attorney wants risk mitigation at a higher level than we do for the most part.
So,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah. And what's interesting with all that, as soon as you concede sometimes that it's non-exempt, you have to remember that all the regulations about non-exempt, paying overtime, keeping time records, travel time confusion, is that hours worked or not, all of that comes into play. So speaking of that confusion and common problems, what are some of the common missteps here? We'll start with overtime. What are some mistakes you see with overtime compliance when it comes to hourly employees?
So for
Like I got a stupid easy one. Let me start there. For anybody that still thinks overtime is based on pay period, you're wrong.
What?
Unless you pay weekly. There, I'll start there. If you're bi-weekly, that means you could earn overtime in week 1 and not week 2, or the reverse. All right, now you go. Other common problems.
Yep. So it starts with your work week. There is a 7-day work week, and that may be Monday to Sunday. So it's the hours that you work in your standard 7-day work week that are factored in total hours worked for that week. Anything over 40 in that 7-day period is going to qualify for overtime wages as a non-exempt employee. So that is probably the biggest issue with clients that have a biweekly or a semi-monthly pay period, is understanding it's not the whole entire pay period. It's not a set 2-week or a half-month pay cycle. It's a 7-day work week that you have to consider. So that's the first thing. The second thing is it's not just your hourly rate of pay that is 1.5 times that is your overtime rate. There's other compensation that comes into play when determining what that overtime rate is. So for example, I may be an hourly employee earning $15 an hour, but I also earn commissions on sales that I make. Maybe I get a weekly or a monthly bonus if I meet certain sales objectives, or I'm just doing a really good job and I get a bonus that I've earned based on matrix and so on. That all gets factored into your total compensation when you determine what your overtime rate of pay is. So you take that hourly rate of pay, you combine it with all the other forms of compensation that you get, and then you determine what your overtime rate is. And a lot of employers miss that. They think it's...
A lot of payroll companies miss that,
They
too.
think it's just your hourly rate of pay, and it's not. And I recently had a client that was a huge, huge hit for, because it ended up resulting in an audit through the Department of Labor, and they took a hit. And unfortunately, it can be a financial impact that you don't want as an employer. So it's important that you understand all of the components that go into that overtime rate, who's qualified, who's not qualified, and so on.
Well, back to our point of risk mitigation, I promise all of you, for the few Department of Labor investigations I've sat in on to try and help a client, you don't want them mulling around your payroll records. You don't. You don't want them mulling around their payroll records. You don't, even if you are exonerated, so to speak, they're going to take up a lot of your time. Which is why, if you just get this right on the front end and are credible to your staff in terms of if they have any problem, we even have, right in the handbook that we create, if you are not in agreement with how you're being paid or what you're seeing on your paycheck, please come to us so that we can either explain it or fix it. I think we call it administrative pay corrections. But you do those things and you've got a really good chance of, even if you've made a mistake, if you empower employees to voice their concerns and take them seriously and correct those mistakes, conceding that they may have known more than you, that's pretty good risk mitigation. Talk a little bit, because you mentioned it a bit, and because we're at the holiday bonus time of year, we could do a whole Uncomplicating HR on discretionary versus non-discretionary bonuses, but you already touched on it a little bit. Can you tell everybody just baseline the difference and what to take into consideration, particularly for hourly employees, and whether or not they're due overtime?
So discretionary is at the discretion of the company. They give a bonus end of year. It's all based on where the company...
Because they felt like it.
Because they felt like being generous
That's right.
and kind right before the holidays. Or it doesn't even have to be at the end of the year. It could be mid-year.
No, it doesn't.
It's at the discretion of the company. It's never something that's assumed or guaranteed by any employee of the company. It's greatly appreciated, but it's not a
And there's no true performance metrics tied to it,
There's-
and it sure isn't written into a compensation
no.
plan.
And then the opposite of that, non-discretionary, is something that the employee earned, whether it's a sales bonus or, a performance-based bonus or, some type of matrix in place where that employee has to meet certain points in order to qualify for that bonus. That is non-discretionary. And as long as they meet all of that criteria, they will receive that bonus. So it's that expectation of getting it, and it's a guaranteed payout. The number or percentage may vary based on, certain criteria, but it is expected. So that would be the difference between the two. And the non-discretionary bonuses are considered compensation when determining overtime wages. Discretionary are not. So we do not have to include those when determining that overtime rate.
There you go. That's it. All right, let's navigate a little bit. I was going to ask you about travel time, but what we should which we should touch base on first is remote work, distributed teams, and how this shows up in wage and hour compliance. I don't even have a pulse on this. I don't have a pulse on how many, as a percentage of the remote workforce, how many of them are really non-exempt, or their employers realize they're non-exempt. But we know they're out there, right? Non-exempt employees working from a home office, being paid generally by the hour. Talk about some of the pitfalls in that and the confusion in that. What is and is not hours worked, record keeping, all of those things. Tell everybody a little bit about your experience with this.
So this comes up a lot with clients that have a remote population in place. And, there's always concerns about, I don't know if my employees are actually sitting at their desk and working all day long when they're supposed to. How do I know that they're not, sitting in their backyard swimming in the pool or, doing lawn work or laundry? How do we know? Well, we don't unless you have a tracking system in order to log hours and, different platforms that you would use from your technology. But essentially, as an exempt employee, whether you work 4 hours that day or 10 hours that day,
doesn't matter, you're paid a salary.
You get paid your salary no matter what. So, we're really not going to be nitpicky about every minute and every second of every day that you're working. Ideally, we want you to be available and working throughout the workday as we see fit. So, as a
is it fair to say that with the salary exempt truly qualifies to be exempt? What you're really looking for is outcomes, not necessarily hard and fast hours worked.
Yes, I would agree with that. So,
Yeah.
And then for your non-exempt employees, you really should be tracking the actual hours that they're performing work. Now, we all work remote in the Inspiring HR environment, and if I need to get up and use the restroom, it would be no different than if I were in a office setting where I get up, leave my desk, and walk to the restroom. I'm gone for 5 minutes and come back. I'm not logging in and out or clocking in and out from my time as a non-exempt employee. So you have to factor that in. You have that at home, and you really just kind of have to get over the fact that they're working remotely.
Right.
If you're going to take a break that's longer than 20 minutes in length, where I'm going to go and fold 3 loads of laundry and, catch up with a show that I've been watching. That's a true break, and that's not compensable. That's so
right.
I should not be compensated for that time that I'm doing personal things. And the expectation needs to be set that, if you are attending to personal matters that are greater than 20 minutes in length, then you need to record your time appropriately. Anything less than, or at 20 minutes or less, under
paid.
As far as pay is concerned, you're required to pay that time. Anything over 20 minutes, you do not have to pay. So
That's right.
just making sure that you're effectively communicating and setting expectations with your employees as to what you expect from them when they're in a remote environment.
And an employee handbook does that, or at least it's a starting point before you get granular at all.
Yes, of course.
Yes. So we have clients, ourselves included, that occasionally ask remote employees to travel. Now, if they're exempt and salaried, cool, easy. If they're non-exempt, talk a little bit about travel time in 2 ways. Travel that requires overnight versus local travel during the day and non-exempt? Touch on those two dynamics.
So let's talk about traveling throughout the day. So I'm going to use a home healthcare agency as an example. So we have several clients that are in that industry, and they have caregivers that go and care for clients. And throughout their workday, they're working an 8-hour shift. They have 4 clients throughout the day, and they're going from client A to client B to client C, and so on. That is an entire workday. So the amount of time that it takes to travel from client A to client B, you would compensate them for that time. Now, the exception to that would be is maybe they have an hour, 90 minutes, 2 hours in between client A and client B, where they can go and they can do their own thing. They can go get lunch, they can grab their laundry, they can stop at Walmart and do some shopping. That's personal time. So if you have that personal time in between the travel between A and B, then you don't have to compensate for that time. So really understanding the timing perspective and what that employee is capable of doing during that travel is going to drive whether or not you need to compensate for that travel time or not. If you're asking someone to travel out of state to attend a conference or a training seminar of some kind as part of their job responsibilities, as a non-exempt employee, the time that you spend traveling is going to be compensated. Whether that's driving in a car from location to location A to B, or on an airplane or on a train, or whatever your method of travel is, that time should be compensated.
Yes, because it's a requirement of your work, hence compensable hours worked.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And the same thing for attending the event itself.
Yeah.
During the hours of the day that you're in attendance for the conference or the training or whatever it is that you're attending, that time is also compensated for. Now, when it comes to sleep time, when you're sleeping, you're not working. So, I mean, that's pretty simple there. We're not going to compensate for that time.
Well, the gray area I always saw in this is how much freedom do you have? Like, I know there are like non-exempt employees that like go to the SHRM conference. SHRM, like it or hate it, has decided that it's a good use of everyone's funds to bring in rock bands for one of the night. But there are plenty of people that are fried from the sessions throughout the day that they don't go to that concert. They want to have cocktails with somebody or visit a friend or go sleep. And in that case, no, that's not hours worked. In fact, I'd argue if you do go to that rock concert, I'm not so sure that's hours worked either. I'm a little annoyed with this SHRM feeling like that's the best use of dollars spent on that very expensive event. But anyway, I often use that as an example. Let me see if I answered this correctly, because I'm out of practice sometimes. I don't even have clients anymore except for one. I had one of our gray collar, might be blue collarish clients ask, we're a Virginia-based company, employees paid by the hour. We've got a job down in North Carolina. It's a 2-hour drive. Do I really have to pay him while he's sitting in the van, talking on the phone, riding the car as a passenger? And I said, yeah, you got to pay him. He's an hourly employee. That's hours worked to get from where he started his day to where he has to work. That's not normal commute time from his house to your office. Correct?
Correct. Yes.
Correct.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. All right, I got a zinger for you. Ready? We'll wrap this up with a zinger. And then I'll close with why is HR still the bad guy? So just keep that in the back of your head. Also in the remote work world and where we've headed with all of this, 30 employees in 20 states. And a couple of those states are what we call Tier 4, California and New York. A lot of regulations, a lot of benefits to those employees, some that are in New York and California, some of which are payroll tax funded. If a client says to you, I get that I've chosen to operate in 20 states and I'm probably crazy for doing so, how do I keep this employee handbook and the addendums down to a dull roar? What's your general recommendation to simplify all of this? How do we tackle it?
So it's actually a great topic to talk about, because I am currently going through a similar situation with a client, and I'm working on a handbook, and they have, I think, 23 states that they have an employee presence in. So my initial conversation with my client was, how complex do you want this, or how simple do you want this? Because we can simplify it and say, what is the most generous law between the 20 states that you have? And are you willing to take that law for that specific state and apply it across the board for all of your employees? That is the most simple way to do that. It doesn't always work out for every specific policy, but a lot of them it does. And for this client that I was referencing, we made that decision. Yes, let's go ahead and do that. Let's look at all of the different state applicable policies and let's apply the most generous. And then if it's not a policy that applies to all states, so maybe like a state mandated benefit, then we'll just keep that separate. And usually in those situations, I'll ask my client, well, do you want to include that all in one handbook, or do you want to extract that state specific information from the main handbook and have an addendum that will only give to employees that are working in that state?
That are in
to
that
me,
state.
you know, especially if you have a large employee population, I think it's important to keep that separate so they have a good understanding of what's offered in their state versus, you know, the main handbook policies. Otherwise, I feel like it just gets lost, because right now I'm working on this handbook and it's probably 80 something pages long because
Way too long.
of all
Way
of
too long.
the states. So we may have to regroup and change our thought process there, but it's a work in progress and we figure it out and we determine what is the best way to simplify.
This is why I'm a little bit troubled by, no offense to the payroll companies that want to add on HR services, but when you're using technology with all kinds of legalese in it to spit it. When you're just doing the intake form and you say, I'm in 20 states and these are the 20 states, and you're using like an employee handbook builder module, it's a quick way to get to the handbook finish line. You're going to end up almost with like a 200-page document. And then if it's bad enough that it's 200 pages of a lot of legalese that your managers won't use and your employees won't understand, the handbook's no good when it's out of date. And if you don't understand what came out of the handbook creator, who's going to keep it current? So that's to Julie's point why once you're going north of 80 pages, I'm more of a fan of the addendums model. Everything that affects everybody goes in the main handbook. And if there are standalone policies that are only applied to people in Massachusetts and California and New York, those can get trimmed down, by the way. Like our California addendum, I know it's like 40, 45 pages. But if we've got a client that takes what is possible to be a California standard and apply it to everybody else, you start to trim that addendum down to a dull roar, because a lot of those policies then migrate into the main handbook. Like we did with California paid sick leave almost 10 years ago. We were eventually going to be as generous as we are with paid time off, but I got to credit California for forcing my hand, because back then we were all part-time flex staff except me. But I wasn't going to give Lisa paid sick leave and nobody else. It's a bad message. So we even had our own journey of incorporating some of these state-specific standards company-wide.
Okay.
All right, let's wrap up. We've got 5 minutes. Why is it, it's two parts. Why is HR still the bad guy, in your opinion? What do you think? Why is HR still the bad guy? Why, even for those of us that are good at it and as bright and sunny as you and I are, why do people still dread HR being invited into the room?
We get dragged into conversations when it's at a point where something is broken and needs to be fixed, or someone has performance issues or behavioral issues and we need to come in and toe the line. So they're calling us in a bad time with that employee.
Well, that's true.
I can't tell you how many times where I've been asked to sit in on conversations that my clients are having with employees as it relates to their behavior or their performance. And just my presence alone just puts that employee
Unnerves
on
people.
edge. I might
I
get
know.
fired. HR is here. We just have that reputation of being the bad
terrible.
guy. Like we're the
It's terrible.
and I think a lot of it is because we create the policies and we are the driver to enforcing them within the company. And if there's a violation and they come to us and a manager comes to us and says, I have an employee that violated this policy, what do? We have to help them figure out what to do from there. So we're involved in the process. A lot of people look at us like they have to go to the principal's office and they're going to be scolded and put in detention. I hear that all the time, when I get called into conversation. So it's unfortunate because
just wish we could change it. I wrote a blog years ago that said, if you're still an HR professional that is happy about being called the Terminator or the police, you are not in a modern day workplace. So I still want to see that changed. But I will challenge the small business owners who maybe have an office admin catch-all that dabbles in HR, or maybe you've hired an HR generalist. If you're going to joke about them being the rules police, stop asking them to plan the holiday party. These two things are in conflict with one another, so you might want to think about that. All right, last thing. What do you still love about HR after all these years, from when you were hired as a benefit specialist at staff leasing to everything in between in the last 10 years here? What do you still love about HR?
So it's a funny question, and to kind of go back to what we were just speaking of HR being the bad guy. Lori sent me a message on Teams yesterday, and she's been assisting a client with a pretty heavy lift in an employee situation and potential lawsuit. And
Great.
And it's one of those situations. She said in her message, I feel like we're always being reached out to by clients in bad situations. There's never
they're in real pain.
There's never something that they just come to us that's a happy point in their operations and they just want to say hello. They're calling us for bad reasons. And that's true, which is why it's
most part.
One of the things that and it's really my personality. It's not something about HR, but this is what I bring to HR that keeps me happy in the HR environment. Something that's just so important to me is being connected with my clients. I want there to be a personal connection so that when they call me, it's not just immediate right into whatever the problem is. I want them to call me and say, hey, how are you doing? Hey, the last time we talked, you were telling me that you're getting ready to go on a cruise to wherever. How was it? I want them to feel emotionally connected to me, that we have a personal relationship and a professional relationship. And we can be very casual, we can be very formal, however we need to be, so that we can have a trustworthy relationship and work well together. And I often find with those clients that I have those relationships with, we have those personal conversations. And it's not just the bad and the ugly. And so I think that's what keeps me happy in my environment, is that I can connect to so many people and I can help them when they need help. And it's not, I'm not always the bad guy. I can provide some good happiness and fun to their work environment in their life. So, that's probably the thing that I love most. It's just
I would agree.
So many different.
I would agree. I think I find a lot of joy in still, even if I'm more involved in sales and service these days, those aha moments, even when I see the look on their face of relief, like, good idea, I'll try that. Thank you. So I didn't think of that. Like, those are real victories with me. And that's why it's always nice, really, in a consultative role to, as you said, commit to building these really long-term relationships, because, like, I know we're getting a run for our money somewhat with AI, but you're not going to get a personal relationship judgment call who's gotten to know you over many years. They know you, they know your family, they know your leadership style, they know what your current workplace culture is and what you want it to grow to. I mean, these are things that we're a long way away from AI being able to discern that, which again is the value of a personalized relationship with an HR consultant. Julie, thank you so much for your time today. Again, happy 10-year anniversary.
Yep.
You are such just an absolute joy to work with. Sometimes I say this and I feel like I sound like your mother. I hope not. But you've contributed so much to our team, and I know our clients adore you, and you have my sincere appreciation for that. Wishing you and your family happy holidays, and it's Friday, so let's go have a good weekend, and I'll talk to you next week.
All right, thank you.
All right, bye everybody.
Bye.